She poured antifreeze into her own daughter's drink. Then she sat across the table, watched her swallow it, and asked if she wanted seconds. Let that land for a second. Because that is not the opening of a horror movie. That is what happened inside a real American home, in a quiet midwestern town, on an ordinary weeknight, to a young woman named Emily Whitfield, a woman who, until the day the doctors told her what was in her blood, had never once doubted that her mother loved her. Never once. Not for a single second of her entire life. Emily had already buried her father. She had already buried her brother. She stood at both graves with her mother on one side of her and her older sister on the other, and she cried, and they held her hands, and she believed with her whole heart that the three of them were a family surviving an unbearable amount of grief together. She had no idea she was the last name on a list. She had no idea that the hand squeezing hers at her brother's funeral had measured out the dose that killed him. She had no idea that grief was the cover story, that the funerals were the plan working exactly as intended, and that the only reason she was still breathing was because a single doctor on a single overnight shift noticed something in her blood work that nobody was supposed to notice. This is the story of Emily Whitfield, a daughter who gave everything she had to the people who were supposed to love her. And this is the story of what those people did with that love. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Whitfield family lived exactly the kind of life that makes you believe some places are still safe. Small town, Midwest, the kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked and brought casseroles when someone was sick. Daniel, the father, worked hard and drank a little too much, but the people who knew him called him a good man. Carol, the mother, was the one other parents pointed to when they wanted an example of someone holding it all together. She remembered every birthday, kept the house clean, had dinner on the table every night at 6. Their 3 children, Megan, Tyler, and Emily, grew up inside what looked, from any angle anyone cared to look, like a perfectly ordinary American family. So here's what we need to understand before this story goes any further. Who were these people, really, beneath the surface of that ordinary life? What was building inside that house that nobody on the outside could see? And how did a woman who baked birthday cakes for her children every single year end up poisoning 3 of them, one by one, inside the same kitchen where she baked them? Daniel Whitfield smelled like sawdust and motor oil when he came home from work. He fell asleep in his recliner before the news was over. He had a drinking problem that everyone in the family knew about and nobody talked about directly, the way families carry certain things in silence for years because naming them out loud feels more dangerous than leaving them alone. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a tired man, a good man underneath his flaws, the kind of father who never missed a Friday night football game no matter how exhausted he was, who coached Little League one summer just because Tyler wanted to play and needed someone patient enough to explain the rules 20 times without losing their temper. Carol was the one who made sure the world saw the family as fine. She was tireless about it. School fundraisers, church committees, the names of every teacher and coach and neighbor memorized because Carol Whitfield did not do things halfway. But underneath that immaculate surface, a resentment had been building for years, slow and quiet and invisible. The resentment of a woman who had decided she was the only adult in a house full of people who needed things from her and gave nothing back. She never said it plainly. She said it in small ways, a comment here, a silence there, things that people around her heard and forgot about, because nothing about Carol ever seemed like a warning sign. She was too put together for that. Megan, the eldest, was sharper and colder than her mother, with less patience and more hunger for a life that looked better than the one she had. She resented the years she had spent helping look after Tyler, her younger brother, who had a developmental disability that meant he would need the people around him for the rest of his life. Tyler was gentle and trusting and completely without defenses. He loved trains. He loved routine. He loved knowing that dinner would be at 6 o'clock because 6 o'clock was when dinner had always been. He never raised his voice. He never asked for anything complicated. He simply trusted the people around him the way a child trusts, completely and without conditions. And then there was Emily. Emily tutored Tyler through every homework assignment he struggled with. Emily picked up extra shifts at a part-time job to help cover groceries without being asked. Emily dreamed about nursing school the way some people dream about a whole different life, quietly and persistently, even when the money wasn't there. She looked up to Megan. She adored her mother. The trust she gave her family was not naive. It was chosen, repeatedly, every single day, because Emily Whitfield genuinely believed the people around her deserved it. That is the family. A good man who drank too much. A mother performing sacrifice so long she forgot it was a performance. An older sister carrying resentment like a second skin. A gentle brother who trusted everyone. And a younger daughter who loved them all without reservation, which meant she was the last one to see what was coming. Daniel Whitfield came home from work on an ordinary night, ate dinner with his family, and settled into his chair with a drink in his hand. By the next morning, Carol found him unresponsive. He was gone before anyone could do anything about it. And the explanation came so easily it barely caused a ripple. Daniel drank. Daniel had health problems. A man like that, in a town like that, dying in his sleep was the kind of thing people shook their heads at and called a tragedy and moved on from within a week. What no one knew, what no one would know for 2 more years, was that Daniel Whitfield had been poisoned. Antifreeze, ethylene glycol, the same chemical sitting in garages across America, has a sweetness that disappears inside a drink without any warning. It shuts down the kidneys, the body's organs failing one after another in a way that can look, to anyone not specifically testing for it, like the natural collapse of a man who simply drank too much for too many years. Whoever did this understood that. And whoever did this had not done it in a moment of rage. They had chosen a method specifically because it was hard to detect, which means they had thought about this before they ever acted on it. 5 months later, Tyler got sick. The same slow, vague symptoms, tired, unsteady, stomach pain, all easily explained by his existing medical history, his seizure disorder, his complex needs. When he was finally rushed to the hospital, it was already too late. He died within days. Doctors noted a faint ring of discoloration around his mouth, the kind of detail that gets written into a chart and then quietly overlooked in the chaos of trying to save someone. The cause of death went down as complications from a pre-existing condition. The funeral was held. Emily stood at her brother's grave the same way she had stood at her father's, between her mother and her sister, drowning in grief. She had absolutely no framework to question. She had now lost her father and her brother inside 12 months. The only explanation running through her mind was that her family had been cursed with the most unbearable string of bad luck imaginable. Within weeks of Tyler's funeral, Emily began to feel sick herself. The same tired legs, the same confusion, the same creeping unsteadiness that she would later describe as feeling like her body was slowly being switched off from the inside. She didn't panic. She told her mother, and her mother told her to rest. Emily was brought into the emergency room with her organs beginning to fail. Doctors cycled through explanations: the flu, heat exhaustion, dehydration, because nothing about her presentation fit neatly into a single category. But one physician on the overnight shift had seen this pattern before, years earlier, in a completely different case, and something about Emily's blood work made him stop. He ordered a toxicology screen that almost nobody requests unless they already have a reason to suspect exactly what they are looking for. The results came back, and the room went quiet. Ethylene glycol, antifreeze, present in Emily's blood at a concentration that ruled out every possible accidental explanation. She had been deliberately poisoned, and within hours of that result, a detective was standing outside her hospital room. That detective did what investigators are trained to do when they encounter something that doesn't make sense in isolation. He looked for the pattern. He pulled Daniel Whitfield's death records. He pulled Tyler's. And for the first time, someone in a position of authority sat down with all 3 cases side by side instead of treating them as 3 separate tragedies inside one unlucky family. A father dead and ruled natural. A disabled son dead and ruled a medical complication. A daughter in a hospital bed with the same poison in her veins as the other 2. 3 people. 1 household. 1 chemical. When you lay it out like that, the only conclusion that makes any sense is also the most devastating one. Testing on Daniel's and Tyler's remains confirmed what the detective already feared. Ethylene glycol in both systems. 2 deaths that had been signed off and closed were, in fact, 2 unsolved homicides. The detective subpoenaed the family's financial records. He found a life insurance policy on Daniel that Carol had collected. He found that Tyler's lifelong care had been costing the family more money every year. He found that Emily's student loans were beginning to create pressure on a household budget Carol controlled entirely. None of those facts were proof by themselves. Together, next to 2 dead bodies and a 3rd poisoning survivor, they described a motive that was almost too cold to say out loud. A neighbor, when investigators knocked on her door, mentioned one thing almost as an afterthought. She said Carol had said something to her once, only once, about how exhausted she was of carrying everyone. She said the tone of it had been strange, colder than anything she'd heard from Carol before, but she dismissed it at the time as a bad day. Investigators did not dismiss it. When Megan was brought in for questioning, she was inconsistent in specific ways, too precise about some things, defensive about others, rehearsed in a manner that experienced detectives recognize immediately. They let her keep talking. Across several interviews, the older sister who had always seemed untouchable began to come apart. And when a search of the Whitfield home turned up antifreeze stored in ordinary household bottles on an ordinary garage shelf, the case stopped being a question of whether and became a question of when. Megan broke first. She didn't say everything, not in that first interview, but she said enough. Enough for detectives to leave that room and walk directly toward Carol Whitfield with everything they had, and lay it all out on a table in front of her. The toxicology, the insurance money, the antifreeze in the garage, the pattern that 3 cases side by side made impossible to deny. Carol had held herself together through 2 funerals, through a vigil at her surviving daughter's hospital bed, through weeks of investigation with a composure that had quietly unsettled everyone around her. In that interrogation room, the composure finally went. She confessed. She said Daniel had become a burden, a man who drank too much and contributed too little. She said Tyler, her son who loved trains and trusted every person he had ever met without exception, had become a financial weight she was no longer willing to carry. She said Emily's student debt was becoming a problem. She had looked at her own children and run the numbers and reached a conclusion that should not be possible for any human being to reach about their own family. And then she had acted on it. Investigators found Megan's private journal. Entries written before her father died described how much easier things would be once certain people were gone. Entries written after Tyler's funeral described a feeling of peace, a strange calm settling over her in the days after she helped bury her own brother. This was not a woman who had been manipulated or coerced into participation. This was a woman who had wanted this outcome and had written about wanting it in her own handwriting, in a journal she kept under her own bed. Both women were arrested and charged with murder. The town that had once admired Carol Whitfield for holding her family together spent the following days trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same woman that could not exist inside the same person. They had no framework for it. Neither did anyone who had ever known her. Before the trial, Megan accepted a plea deal. She would plead guilty to her role in the murders and, in exchange, testify against Carol on the stand. A daughter, raised by the woman she was now helping to convict, sitting in a courtroom and describing exactly how her mother had decided to start killing her own family. Whether you see that as justice or as one more act of calculation from a woman who had always put her own survival first depends entirely on how much grace you are willing to extend to someone who helped poison her father and her brother. The town was split. Most people watching the trial from the outside were too. Carol Whitfield was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Megan received a lesser sentence with a theoretical, decades-away possibility of release. And Emily, who had suffered lasting organ damage from the poisoning, who had spent months recovering in a body that had been betrayed from inside her own home, emerged from everything with something nobody expected. When she finally spoke publicly, she said she chose to see herself as a survivor rather than a victim. And then she said she forgave her mother. Not because what Carol did was forgivable, but because Emily Whitfield had decided that her mother would not get to keep living rent-free inside her head for the rest of her life. Grace, the youngest Whitfield child, 9 years old when the arrests were made, was placed into foster care. A little girl who had done nothing wrong and lost everything anyway, absorbing the wreckage of decisions she was never old enough to understand. In every story like this one, there is always a Grace, the quietest victim, the one whose loss gets the least attention, the one who simply has to keep growing up after the adults around her destroyed everything. So here is what I want to leave you with. Emily Whitfield sat at 2 funerals for the people she loved, flanked by the 2 people who had killed them, and she felt nothing but grief. She had no reason to feel anything else. She had been given every reason to trust those women her entire life, and trust is not a flaw. It is what makes us human. The question this story keeps asking is not how Carol could do something like this. The question is how something this dark can grow so quietly inside a place that looks, from every angle anyone bothers to look, like home. Was justice really served here? And if you had been sitting at that dinner table, would you have seen it coming? Drop your answer in the comments.